Hey everyone, tonight we journey into the darkest corners of a galaxy far, far away, where the most sadistic minds in Imperial history forged their terrible legacy. This is the story of how cruelty became an art form, how suffering was weaponized, and how the most twisted souls rose to power by perfecting the science of pain itself. So before you settle in for this epic tale, I need to ask for your support. Only about 79% of my viewers are actually subscribed. If you're enjoying these deep dives into galactic lore, hitting that subscribe button would genuinely help this channel grow. And please, take a moment to like this video if you find these stories as fascinating as I do. If you're hungry for even more Star Wars lore and want to explore different corners of this incredible universe, do check out my friend's channel Loreverse. I've added the link in the description below. I'm genuinely curious about our global community of lore enthusiasts, so drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the galaxy. There's something magical about knowing we're all connected through these stories, whether you're in Tokyo at dawn or London at midnight. Now dim those lights, get comfortable under your blankets, and let's begin this haunting chronicle together. In the vast expanse of the galaxy where stars burn cold and distant, there existed beings whose capacity for cruelty transcended mere evil and became something far more terrifying, something almost artistic in its precision. These were not simply villains driven by anger or greed, but architects of anguish who studied suffering as scholars, study ancient texts, who refined torture as artisans perfect their craft. Long ago, in the deepest vaults beneath the Imperial palace on Coruscant, there lay hidden a collection so terrible that even the most hardened Sith Lords spoke of it only in whispers. It was called the Crimson Archive, and within its blood-red walls were preserved the personal methodologies, the intimate techniques, and the philosophical treatises of the Empire's most sadistic practitioners. But here is where our tale truly begins, with a discovery so shocking that it would shake the very foundations of what we thought we knew about Imperial cruelty. For in those archives, investigators would uncover evidence of something called Project Midnight Garden, a systematic program designed not merely to create cruel officers, but to cultivate sadism itself as if it were a living thing, growing and spreading throughout the galaxy like some terrible flowering darkness. The records spoke of experiments so precise, so methodically documented, that they read like scientific journals rather than accounts of torture. There were detailed studies of how different species experienced pain, psychological profiles, mapping the exact moment when hope transforms into despair, and most chilling of all, training manuals that taught Imperial officers not just to inflict suffering, but to savor it, to find genuine pleasure in the artful destruction of another being's spirit. Among these documents were the personal logs of figures whose names still bring fear to those who survived their reign. Admiral Ozzel's meticulous notes on using failure as a teaching tool, watching subordinates crumble under the weight of impossible expectations, Grand Moff Tarkin's philosophical writings on fear as the ultimate form of governance, treating entire star systems as laboratories for his theories of controlled terror. But perhaps most disturbing of all were the recordings found deep within the archive's most secure section, voice logs that captured the actual thoughts and reasoning of these architects of agony as they perfected their craft. In one particularly haunting entry, dated just weeks before the Battle of Yavin, an unnamed Imperial researcher describes breakthrough after breakthrough in what they called empathy extraction, the systematic removal of compassion from promising young officers. The investigation team that uncovered these archives reported something that chilled them more than any individual act of cruelty they documented. It was the realization that this was not chaos, not random evil born of passion or madness. This was systematic, methodical, and worst of all, it was working. The Empire had not simply recruited cruel individuals, they had created them, manufactured them like weapons in a factory, each one calibrated for maximum psychological impact. And yet, as terrible as these discoveries were, they represented only the beginning of a mystery that would span decades, cross entire sectors of the galaxy, and ultimately reveal a conspiracy so vast and so deeply rooted in galactic history that it would force everyone who encountered it to question the very nature of evil itself. For you see, the Crimson Archive was not the source of this darkness. It was merely its most recent flowering. The roots of this systematic cruelty stretched back through millennia of Sith teachings, through forgotten experiments conducted in the shadows of the Old Republic, through secret programs that had been quietly shaping galactic culture for thousands of years. Tonight we follow the path of those brave enough to uncover this terrible truth, to document the methodologies of monsters, and to ensure that by understanding the deepest darkness, we might prevent its return. This is their story, and it begins in the sterile corridors beneath Coruscant, where the echo of ancient screams still haunts the walls. 5 years after the Battle of Endor, when the Emperor's funeral pyre had long since cooled and the New Republic struggled to bring order to a shattered galaxy, a different kind of battle was being fought in the depths of Imperial City. This was not a battle of lightsabers or starfighters, but a war against forgetting, against the comfortable lie that evil could be defeated simply by destroying its most visible symbols. The hidden levels beneath what had once been the Emperor's palace stretched deeper than most citizens of Coruscant ever imagined. 27 levels below the surface, past the abandoned detention centers and forgotten interrogation chambers, past the ruins of Palpatine's personal laboratories and the sealed vaults containing his collection of Sith artifacts, there lay a section of the complex that even the Rebel Alliance's most thorough searchers had failed to discover. It was here, in corridors lit by the crimson glow of emergency lighting that had never been switched off, that Dr. Elena Vasquez made her way through shadows that seemed to cling to the walls like living things. She was not a soldier or a Jedi, but something perhaps more dangerous to the remnants of Imperial ideology. She was a historian, a chronicler of truth, and she had been granted unprecedented access to document what the New Republic's intelligence services were calling the most comprehensive collection of Imperial methodology ever discovered. The air in these depths carried a weight that went beyond mere staleness or the metallic tang of recycled atmosphere. There was something almost palpable about the darkness here, as if the walls themselves had absorbed decades of suffering and now radiated it back like heat from sun-baked stone. Every footstep echoed with unusual resonance, creating sounds that seemed to linger longer than they should, as though the very architecture was designed to amplify the acoustics of screams. Dr. Vasquez paused before a massive blast door marked with Imperial insignia she did not recognize. The symbols were similar to those found throughout the Empire's bureaucracy, but these were subtly different, twisted somehow, as if the familiar designs had been corrupted by some malevolent influence. Above the door, in high galactic script so precise it might have been carved by machines, were the words Archive Crimson, Clearance Level Omega, Project Garden of Midnight. Her companions for this descent into documented darkness were as diverse as they were dedicated to their grim task. Agent Callus, former Imperial Security Bureau operative turned Rebel intelligence asset, moved with the careful precision of someone who had once walked these corridors as predator rather than investigator. His face remained carefully neutral, but Dr. Vasquez had noticed how his hand never strayed far from his weapon, how his eyes constantly scanned for threats that logic said could not exist, but instinct insisted might be lurking in every shadow. Beside him walked Professor Davin Senna, the New Republic's leading expert on Imperial administrative structure. Where Callus represented the military precision of their mission, Senna embodied its scholarly purpose. She carried herself with the slightly distracted air of someone more comfortable with books than blasters, her numerous datapads and recording devices marking her as an academic thrust into circumstances she had never imagined during her peaceful years studying political theory on Alderaan before its destruction. Their third companion was perhaps the most unsettling presence in their small group. Medical droid 21B7, on loan from the New Republic Medical Corps, had been specifically programmed to analyze and document the physiological aspects of the torture techniques they expected to encounter. The droid's presence was a necessity, as no organic being could maintain the clinical objectivity required to properly catalogue such horrors without suffering psychological damage. Yet there was something deeply disturbing about watching the droid's optical sensors record each new atrocity with the same dispassionate efficiency it might use to document a routine medical procedure. As the blast door cycled open with a hiss of equalizing pressure, the team was greeted by a sight that would haunt their dreams for years to come. The archive stretched before them like a vast cathedral dedicated to cruelty, its vaulted ceilings disappearing into shadows that no amount of artificial lighting could fully dispel. Along the walls, arranged with the meticulous care of a museum curator, were display cases containing devices whose purposes were immediately and horrifically clear. But it was not the instruments themselves that filled the team with such profound unease. It was the accompanying documentation. Each device, each technique, each method of inflicting suffering was accompanied by detailed technical specifications, effectiveness ratings, and comprehensive usage manuals written with the dry precision of engineering textbooks. This was not the chaotic collection of a madman's lair, but the organized repository of institutional knowledge, the carefully preserved wisdom of an empire built on scientifically refined cruelty. Dr. Vasquez approached the first display case with trembling hands, her historian's training warring with her human revulsion as she began to read the accompanying documentation. The placard, written in the same precise high galactic script as the door inscription, identified the device as a neural resonance feedback amplifier, Mark Verzeven, optimal for enhanced interrogation of force-sensitive subjects, efficiency rating 94.7%, patent filed by Imperial Advanced Weapons Research Coruscant Division. What struck her most profoundly was not the clinical language used to describe instruments of torture, but the realization that this entire archive represented something far more systematic than random evil. This was institutional cruelty, refined over decades, taught to generation after generation of Imperial officers as just another aspect of their duties. The Empire had not simply tolerated sadistic behavior, it had cultivated it, perfected it, and transformed it into a cornerstone of galactic governance. Agent Callus stood before another display case, his face pale as he recognized devices he had once been trained to use during his years with the ISB. "I remember the training sessions," he said quietly, his voice barely carrying across the vast space. "They made it seem so logical, so necessary. They taught us that compassion was weakness, that efficient cruelty was a form of mercy because it ended resistance more quickly." Professor Senna was documenting everything with frantic energy, her academic excitement warring with her moral horror as she realized the historical significance of what they had uncovered. "This is unprecedented," she whispered, her recording device capturing not just her words, but the awed terror in her voice. "We're looking at the institutional memory of systematic oppression. This is how evil perpetuates itself, how it passes its knowledge from one generation to the next." The medical droid, meanwhile, had begun its own systematic documentation, its sensors recording detailed scans of each device, while its databases correlated the information with known physiological responses to various forms of trauma. Its clinical observations, delivered in the flat, emotionless tone of artificial intelligence, somehow made the horrors more real rather than less. Device efficiency ratings appear to be based on comprehensive field testing across multiple species, it reported. Data suggests systematic experimentation on live subjects over extended periods. As they moved deeper into the archive, past displays of increasingly sophisticated instruments and ever more detailed documentation, Dr. Vasquez began to understand that their mission was about more than simply cataloging Imperial atrocities. They were uncovering evidence of something that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of evil itself. This was not the work of individuals consumed by dark passions, but the careful construction of an entire philosophy, a worldview that treated suffering not as an unfortunate necessity, but as a valuable resource to be harvested and refined. And yet, even as they documented these horrors, even as they prepared to ensure that this knowledge would be preserved as a warning to future generations, Dr. Vasquez could not shake the feeling that they were only seeing the surface of something far deeper and more terrible. The organization, the sophistication, the sheer scope of what they were discovering suggested roots that stretched back far beyond the rise of Palpatine's empire. Somewhere in these archives lay the answers to questions she was not yet ready to ask, secrets that would reveal not just how the Empire had perfected cruelty, but why they had needed to perfect it at all. The discovery that would change everything came not from the grand displays of torture devices or the meticulously organized chambers of documented suffering, but from a small, seemingly insignificant data terminal tucked away in what appeared to be an administrative alcove. Dr. Vasquez had been examining the archive's organizational structure when her historian's eye caught something that made her pause. The terminal's display showed access logs that dated back not years but decades, with entries that continued right up until the day before the Emperor's death aboard the second Death Star. Professor Senna noticed her colleague's sudden stillness and approached with the quiet concern of someone who had spent enough time in these depths to recognize when another person had encountered something particularly disturbing. "What is it, Elena?" she asked softly, her voice carrying that peculiar quality that sound acquired in spaces where too many terrible things had happened. "Someone was here very recently," Dr. Vasquez replied, her fingers hovering over the terminal's interface as if afraid to disturb evidence of this recent presence. "These logs show regular access patterns right up until Endor. But that's not what concerns me most. Look at the frequency of visits during the final months of the war. Someone was coming here almost daily, downloading massive amounts of data, cross-referencing files across multiple Imperial databases." Agent Callus moved closer to examine the terminal over her shoulder, his ESB training allowing him to interpret the access codes and clearance levels displayed on the screen. What he saw made his expression darken considerably. "Those are Emperor's hand authorization codes," he said quietly. "Only Palpatine's most trusted agents carried clearances that high, but according to our intelligence, all known Emperor's hands were accounted for after Endor. Either we missed someone, or there's been a security breach at the highest levels." The medical droid, meanwhile, had been conducting its own systematic scan of the alcove and announced its findings with characteristic clinical detachment. "Organic residue analysis indicates multiple individuals accessed this location within the final standard month before Imperial defeat at Endor. DNA signatures suggest at least 3 different species, including what appears to be a near-human variant with physiological markers consistent with force sensitivity." But it was Professor Senna who made the connection that transformed their archaeological mission into something far more urgent. While examining the downloaded file directories, she noticed patterns that suggested someone had been specifically researching historical precedents for what the Empire had been doing. The search terms recovered from the terminal's memory banks revealed an investigation into ancient Sith techniques, pre-Republic torture methodologies, and most disturbing of all, theoretical frameworks for large-scale psychological conditioning of entire planetary populations. "They weren't just documenting these techniques," Senna said, her academic composure beginning to crack as the implications became clear. "Someone was building on them, extrapolating from them, trying to develop something new. Look at these research queries about neural pathway modification, about using the Force to implant behavioral patterns, about creating sleeper agents who wouldn't even know they'd been programmed." Dr. Vasquez felt a chill that had nothing to do with the archive's climate control as she began to understand what they had stumbled upon. This wasn't simply a repository of Imperial cruelty, it was an active research facility that had been operating right up until the Empire's collapse. More troubling still, the evidence suggested that whoever had been conducting this research had escaped with comprehensive data about techniques that made traditional torture look primitive by comparison. The terminal's deeper files, protected by encryption that Agent Callus's ISB experience allowed him to crack, revealed something called Project Eternal Garden. Unlike the systematic cruelty documented elsewhere in the archive, this project appeared to focus on what its creators termed hereditary conditioning. The research notes described experiments in modifying genetic material to predispose subjects toward either extreme aggression or complete submission, with the ultimate goal of breeding entire populations that could be controlled through biological imperatives rather than external force. "My God," whispered Professor Senna, as she read through files that detailed multi-generational experiments conducted on isolated worlds throughout the Outer Rim. They were trying to evolve compliance. They wanted to create species that would be literally incapable of rebellion, whose descendants would serve the Empire not because they were forced to, but because their very biology compelled them towards submission. But perhaps most chilling of all were the personal logs they discovered. Recordings made by the project's lead researcher in the months before Endor. The voice belonged to someone they would later identify as Dr. Cornelius Evazan, the notorious criminal doctor who had briefly encountered Luke Skywalker on Tatooine years earlier. His escape from Imperial custody had apparently been orchestrated specifically to bring his expertise in biological modification to this project. In these recordings, Evazan spoke with the casual enthusiasm of a scientist discussing a fascinating puzzle rather than the systematic violation of everything decent beings held sacred. He described breakthrough after breakthrough in what he called empathy suppression genetics, techniques that could literally breed the capacity for compassion out of future generations. His excitement was palpable as he detailed early results from test populations, worlds where entire bloodlines had been secretly modified over decades to produce children who felt no emotional connection to others' suffering. The recordings also revealed that Project Eternal Garden was merely one branch of a much larger initiative called the Contingency, Palpatine's ultimate insurance policy against the possibility of Imperial defeat. Unlike Operation Cinder, which was designed to punish the galaxy for failing the Empire, the Contingency was focused on ensuring that even if the Empire fell, its underlying philosophy would continue to spread like a virus through galactic civilization. Agent Callus recognized some of the worlds mentioned in Evazan's logs, planets where the ISB had conducted population surveys that he had always assumed were standard intelligence gathering operations. The realization that he had unknowingly participated in the early phases of this genetic manipulation program hit him like a physical blow. "I helped them identify target populations," he said, his voice barely audible. "All those surveys, all those demographic studies I filed reports on, they used my data to select which bloodlines to modify." Dr. Vasquez found herself facing a decision that would have seemed impossible when their mission began. The historian in her demanded that they document everything, that they preserve this evidence for future generations to study and learn from. But the human being in her, the part that still believed in the possibility of hope and healing, wondered whether some knowledge was too dangerous to preserve. The choice was made for her when Professor Senna discovered that the terminal was still connected to external networks, still capable of transmitting data to locations throughout the galaxy. Someone, somewhere, was continuing to monitor this archive. Their presence had not gone unnoticed, and even now encrypted signals were being sent to coordinates that their computer systems could not trace. As alarms began to sound in the depths of the archive, as security systems that should have been dormant for years suddenly came to life around them, Dr. Vasquez realized that their mission of historical documentation had transformed into something far more immediate and dangerous. They were no longer simply studying the Empire's legacy of cruelty. They had stumbled into evidence that this legacy was still very much alive, still growing, still spreading its poisonous influence through carefully laid plans that the Empire's defeat had barely interrupted. The ancient darkness they had come to document had noticed them in return, and somewhere in the galaxy, inheritors of the Empire's most twisted ambitions were deciding what to do about these unwelcome visitors to their sanctuary of systematic evil. The game had changed, and the stakes were no longer historical accuracy, but the future of free will itself. In that moment, surrounded by the sterile evidence of institutionalized cruelty, listening to alarms that announced their discovery to unknown watchers, Dr. Vasquez understood that they had crossed a line from which there could be no retreat. They had seen too much, learned too much, and now they would have to choose between their own safety and the galaxy's right to know what horrors were still being planned in secret laboratories and hidden facilities across countless worlds. The call to adventure had been answered, but the cost of that answer was only beginning to become clear. The emergency evacuation from the Crimson Archive marked the end of academic detachment and the beginning of something far more dangerous. As klaxons wailed through corridors that had been silent for years, as blast doors began cycling shut with mechanical precision that suggested someone was trying to trap them in the depths, Dr. Vasquez and her team found themselves racing through maintenance tunnels that Agent Callus remembered from his ISB days, pathways that the Empire's architects had never intended for use by anyone seeking to escape rather than to imprison. They emerged into the pale artificial dawn of Coruscant's surface levels, 12 hours later, their clothes still carrying the metallic scent of the Archive's recycled air, their minds reeling from exposure to systematic evil that none of them had been prepared to confront. But what should have been relief at escaping those oppressive depths instead became the first step into a larger maze of questions that would consume the remainder of their lives. The safe house that New Republic intelligence had provided was a modest apartment in one of Coruscant's middle levels, the kind of anonymous space that millions of beings called home, without ever realizing that their neighbors might be documenting the galaxy's darkest secrets. Here, surrounded by the mundane comforts of civilian life, the team began the process of analyzing what they had discovered and planning their next moves. Professor Senna had managed to download several terabytes of data before their hurried departure, files that would take months to fully analyze, but which already revealed disturbing patterns. The genetic modification experiments documented in Project Eternal Garden were not isolated incidents, but part of a systematic program that had been operating across hundreds of worlds for decades. What made the scope of this program particularly terrifying was its patience. These were not the crude, immediate tortures that had characterized most Imperial operations, but subtle modifications that would only reveal their full effects across generations. Agent Callus contributed his knowledge of Imperial administrative structure to help them understand how such a massive undertaking could have remained hidden even from most high-ranking Imperial officials. The project had been compartmentalized to an extraordinary degree, with individual researchers working on specific aspects without understanding the larger framework into which their work fit. Even many of those who participated in the genetic surveys and population studies had no idea they were contributing to a program designed to systematically modify the evolutionary trajectory of entire species. The medical droid's analysis proved equally disturbing. 21B7's clinical assessment of the genetic modification techniques described in the archive suggested that they were far more advanced than anything the New Republic's medical establishment had believed possible. More troubling still, the droid's projections indicated that if these modifications had indeed been implemented as described, their effects would be virtually impossible to reverse using current medical technology. But it was Dr. Vasquez who made the connection that transformed their understanding of what they were dealing with from a historical curiosity into an active threat. Cross-referencing the archive's data with reports from New Republic worlds that had requested medical assistance for unusual genetic conditions, she discovered patterns that suggested Project Eternal Garden's influence was already manifesting across the galaxy. Children born on worlds that appeared in Evazan's logs were showing unusually high rates of what medical professionals had classified as empathy deficit disorders. These children were not cruel or sadistic in the traditional sense, but they displayed a profound inability to form emotional connections with others, an almost mechanical approach to relationships that treated other beings as objects to be manipulated rather than individuals to be understood. More disturbing still were reports from educators on these same worlds describing students who showed exceptional aptitude for strategic thinking and organizational efficiency, but who consistently failed to develop normal moral reasoning abilities. These children could analyze complex ethical scenarios with remarkable precision, but only in terms of outcomes and effectiveness, rather than questions of right and wrong. We're looking at the emergence of a generation that's been bred to be perfect Imperial citizens. Professor Senna concluded during one of their late-night analysis sessions. They're not evil in any way that we would recognize, but they're constitutionally incapable of the kind of empathetic thinking that makes rebellion possible. They'll serve whatever authority structure exists, not because they're forced to, but because the alternative simply won't occur to them. The decision to expand their investigation beyond the archive came naturally, though none of them fully understood the personal cost that decision would entail. Vasquez formally requested extended research leave from the University of Alderaan's new campus, while Professor Senna took a sabbatical from her position with the New Republic's historical documentation project. Agent Callus, whose official status with New Republic intelligence gave him access to resources and transportation, became their liaison with the broader intelligence community. Their first destination was Malastare, one of the worlds that appeared most frequently in Evazan's research logs. The planet had been liberated from Imperial control relatively early in the rebellion, and its population had generally been cooperative with New Republic reconstruction efforts. On the surface, it appeared to be exactly the kind of success story that the new government pointed to as evidence of their effectiveness. The journey from Coruscant to Malastare, aboard a converted Imperial transport, gave the team time to process what they had learned and prepare for what they might discover. The ship itself, once used to ferry prisoners to Imperial detention facilities, had been refitted as a mobile research platform, its former holding cells converted into laboratories and data analysis centers. There was something grimly appropriate about using the Empire's own tools to investigate its legacy of systematic cruelty. During the 3-day hyperspace journey, they established protocols for their investigation that would serve them throughout their expanded mission. Each world they visited would be approached as both a historical site and a potential crime scene. They would document not just the evidence of genetic modification programs, but the ongoing effects of those programs on the populations that had been subjected to them. Agent Callus used his intelligence contacts to gather detailed background information on Malastare's recent history, looking for patterns that might have been invisible to investigators who weren't specifically searching for evidence of biological manipulation. What he discovered was disturbing in its subtlety. The planet's cooperation with New Republic authorities was not the result of political conversion or gratitude for liberation, but rather a kind of bureaucratic compliance that treated one government much the same as another. Professor Senna, meanwhile, focused on analyzing the specific techniques that Evazan's logs suggested had been used on Malastare's population. The modifications appeared to target neural pathways associated with emotional bonding and moral reasoning, but in ways that would be almost impossible to detect without sophisticated genetic analysis. The changes were subtle enough that affected individuals would appear completely normal in casual interaction, but profound enough to fundamentally alter their approach to ethical decision-making. Dr. Vasquez found herself grappling with questions that went far beyond her training as a historian. How do you document a crime that spans generations and affects the fundamental nature of its victims' minds? How do you preserve evidence of atrocities that were designed to be invisible, that manifested not as obvious suffering, but as the gradual erosion of species' capacity for moral growth? The medical droid, untroubled by such philosophical concerns, busied itself with preparing the technical equipment they would need to conduct genetic analyses on Malastare. Its clinical perspective proved invaluable in designing protocols that would allow them to identify the specific markers associated with Project Eternal Garden's modifications without causing alarm among the populations they were studying. As their ship dropped out of hyperspace and Malastare appeared before them, its surface scarred by centuries of pod racing and industrial exploitation, but its cities rebuilding under New Republic guidance, the team faced the reality that they were no longer simply documenting history. They were investigating an ongoing crime, one whose perpetrators had planned for their own defeat and whose victims might never fully understand what had been done to them. The transformation from academic observers to active investigators was complete, though none of them yet understood how that transformation would change not only their mission but themselves. They were about to discover that some forms of knowledge exact a price from those who seek them, and that understanding the full scope of systematic evil requires a kind of courage that no amount of scholarly preparation can provide. The journey that had begun in the sterile archives beneath Coruscant was about to become something far more personal, far more dangerous, and far more necessary than any of them had imagined. Malastare's capital city of Pixelito sprawled across the planet's equatorial region like a mechanical organism that had grown rather than been built. Its architecture, a mixture of gleaming New Republic construction and the utilitarian Imperial structures that local authorities had been reluctant to demolish. From the observation deck of their mobile research platform, Dr. Vasquez watched the morning bustle of millions of beings going about their daily lives, each one potentially carrying modifications to their genetic structure that they would never know existed. The team's first formal meeting was with Administrator Herrick Davos, a Dug who had served in various governmental positions throughout the Imperial occupation and had seamlessly transitioned to serving the New Republic with the same bureaucratic efficiency. His cooperation was immediate and comprehensive, exactly the kind of response that had made Malastare a model for successful planetary transition. It was also Dr. Vasquez was beginning to realize exactly the kind of unnatural compliance that Everzan's research had been designed to produce. Of course, we welcome any historical research that might help us better understand our recent past, Administrator Davos said, his words carrying the polite enthusiasm that characterized all his interactions with authority figures. The Imperial period was certainly challenging, but we've adapted well to our new circumstances. Our citizens are remarkably resilient and cooperative. Professor Senna, whose academic background had made her sensitive to the subtle indicators of social conditioning, noticed something in the administrator's responses that troubled her. His cooperation was too complete, too immediate, lacking the healthy skepticism that most planetary officials displayed when presented with research requests. More disturbing still was his consistent use of language that suggested he viewed his population not as citizens with individual rights and interests, but as resources to be managed for optimal efficiency. Agent Callus, meanwhile, had been conducting discreet inquiries among his intelligence contacts on Malastare, gathering information about the planet's social dynamics since liberation. What he discovered painted a picture that was simultaneously reassuring and deeply unsettling. Crime rates were extraordinarily low, civic compliance was nearly perfect, and political dissent was almost non-existent. On the surface, these appeared to be positive indicators of a healthy society, but Callus's ISB training had taught him to recognize the difference between genuine social harmony and the artificial peace that resulted from systematic population control. The medical droid's preliminary biological surveys of the local population provided the first concrete evidence that their worst fears were justified. Random genetic samples collected during routine medical screenings revealed modification patterns that matched the specifications detailed in Evazan's research logs. The changes were subtle, affecting neural development in ways that would only become apparent over time, but they were unmistakably artificial and unmistakably deliberate. The modifications appear to target specific neurotransmitter pathways associated with emotional bonding and moral reasoning. The droid reported during their evening briefing. Affected individuals would experience normal cognitive development in most areas, but they would show significantly reduced capacity for empathetic response and increased susceptibility to authoritarian suggestion. What made these findings particularly disturbing was their scope. The genetic modifications were present in approximately 60% of the population, with the highest concentration among individuals born during the final decade of Imperial rule. This suggested that Project Eternal Garden had achieved a level of implementation that would fundamentally alter Malastaire's social dynamics for generations to come. Dr. Vasquez began conducting detailed interviews with local educators, medical professionals, and community leaders, ostensibly gathering oral histories about the Imperial period, but actually looking for evidence of the psychological effects that the genetic modifications were supposed to produce. What she discovered was more subtle and more troubling than she had expected. Teachers consistently described their students as remarkably well-behaved and academically capable, but they also noted a troubling lack of curiosity about ethical questions. Children who could solve complex mathematical problems with ease showed little interest in discussions about fairness, justice, or the moral implications of their actions. They were compliant not because they understood the reasons for rules, but because questioning those rules simply didn't occur to them. Medical professionals reported similar observations about their patients' psychological profiles. Adults who had been born during the Imperial modification program showed excellent problem-solving abilities and strong work ethics, but they consistently scored low on standard empathy assessments. More troubling still, they seemed genuinely puzzled when asked to consider the emotional impact of their decisions on others. But perhaps most disturbing of all were the findings that emerged from Professor Senna's analysis of Malastaire's political structure since liberation. The planet's transition to New Republic governance had been remarkably smooth, with virtually no resistance movements or political opposition groups emerging. Initially, this had been celebrated as evidence of successful democratization, but Senna's deeper investigation revealed that the lack of political dissent wasn't due to satisfaction with the new government, but to a fundamental inability among large portions of the population to conceive of alternative governmental structures. The modified population didn't support the New Republic because they believed in its principles, but because they were constitutionally incapable of imagining that things could be different. They accepted whatever authority structure existed with the same mechanical compliance that had made them ideal Imperial subjects, and they would presumably accept whatever came next with equal indifference to questions of legitimacy or justice. As the team's investigation progressed, they began to uncover evidence that Malastair was not an isolated case, but part of a much larger network of modified worlds. Cross-referencing their findings with New Republic medical databases revealed similar genetic patterns on dozens of planets across the galaxy, each one showing the characteristic modifications that indicated exposure to Project Eternal Garden's techniques. The scope of what they were discovering began to overwhelm their initial mission parameters. This was not simply a matter of documenting historical atrocities, but of identifying an ongoing threat to the fundamental nature of galactic civilization. An entire generation had been born with their capacity for moral reasoning systematically compromised, and they were now reaching positions of responsibility within New Republic society. Agent Callus made contact with New Republic Intelligence Headquarters to request expanded mission parameters and additional resources. The response he received was both encouraging and terrifying. intelligence services across the galaxy had been receiving reports of unusual population compliance patterns, but they had interpreted these as positive indicators of successful reconstruction efforts. The possibility that this compliance might be the result of genetic manipulation had not occurred to anyone until Callus filed his preliminary report. Dr. Vasquez found herself confronting the horrifying realization that their discoveries were only the beginning of a much larger investigation. Each piece of evidence they uncovered revealed connections to other worlds, other populations, other aspects of a systematic program that dwarfed anything she had imagined when their mission began. The Empire's legacy of cruelty was not fading with time, but was instead growing stronger as the modified populations matured and began to shape the societies they inhabited. The medical droid, meanwhile, had begun analyzing the technical aspects of the genetic modifications with increasing alarm. The techniques used were far more sophisticated than anything in the New Republic's medical databases, suggesting access to research facilities and expertise that should not have existed within the Empire's known infrastructure. More troubling still, the modifications showed signs of ongoing refinement, as if someone had been perfecting the techniques even as the Empire collapsed. Professor Senna's historical analysis revealed patterns that suggested Project Eternal Garden was part of a much older tradition of systematic population control, one that stretched back through centuries of Sith manipulation and ancient techniques for breeding compliant populations. The Empire had not invented these methods, but had instead perfected and industrialized approaches to genetic manipulation that had been used by dark side practitioners for millennia. As their investigation on Malastare neared its conclusion, the team faced a decision that would define the remainder of their mission. They had uncovered evidence of systematic genetic manipulation on a scale that threatened the fundamental nature of free will across the galaxy. But they had also discovered that this manipulation was so subtle, so carefully designed, that its victims would never recognize what had been done to them. The question was no longer whether they should continue their investigation, but whether they could afford not to. Somewhere in the galaxy, the architects of Project Eternal Garden were still at work, still refining their techniques, still spreading their influence through carefully modified bloodlines that would carry their poison forward into future generations. The initial discoveries on Malastare had revealed the existence of a threat that dwarfed the obvious cruelties of Imperial rule, a form of evil so patient and so sophisticated that it made traditional torture seem crude by comparison. The team that had begun their mission by documenting the Empire's legacy of sadism had discovered something far more dangerous. They had found evidence of a systematic assault on the very essence of what made beings capable of choosing between good and evil. The journey ahead would take them to worlds across the galaxy, into the hidden laboratories where genetic modification had been perfected, and ultimately to a confrontation with enemies who had weaponized evolution itself in service of an ideology that viewed free will as humanity's greatest weakness. The breakthrough came during their 4th week on Malastare, when Professor Senna made a discovery that seemed to provide a coherent explanation for everything they had observed. Hidden within the planet's colonial archives, she found comprehensive documentation of what appeared to be a natural evolutionary response to Imperial occupation, rather than evidence of deliberate genetic manipulation. The files, meticulously preserved by Malastare's bureaucratic administration, detailed a phenomenon that xenobiologists had observed across multiple worlds during periods of extended authoritarian rule. Populations subjected to systematic oppression often developed what researchers termed adaptive compliance syndrome, a suite of behavioral modifications that increased survival rates under totalitarian regimes. The symptoms matched almost perfectly with what the team had been interpreting as evidence of artificial genetic modification. Dr. Vasquez felt a mixture of relief and professional embarrassment as she reviewed Senna's findings. The patterns they had identified could indeed be explained through conventional evolutionary psychology rather than the sinister genetic manipulation program they had hypothesized. Populations that developed increased compliance behaviors and reduced capacity for rebellion would naturally have higher survival rates under Imperial rule, leading to these traits becoming more prevalent over time through simple natural selection. Agent Callus, however, found himself troubled by aspects of the explanation that didn't quite align with his knowledge of Imperial administrative practices. During his years with the ISB, he had observed firsthand how the Empire dealt with non-compliant populations, and their methods were typically far more direct than allowing natural evolutionary processes to gradually modify behavioral patterns. The Empire was not known for its patience with long-term solutions when immediate force could achieve the same results. The medical droid's analysis supported Professor Senna's conclusions to a remarkable degree. The genetic markers they had identified could indeed be interpreted as natural adaptations rather than artificial modifications. The neural pathway changes associated with reduced empathy and increased authority compliance represented exactly the kind of modifications that evolutionary pressure might produce in populations subjected to systematic persecution over multiple generations. For several days, the team operated under the assumption that their investigation had reached its natural conclusion. They had documented evidence of how Imperial rule had shaped the populations under its control, but through recognizable biological processes rather than the elaborate conspiracy they had initially suspected. Their mission parameters shifted from investigating active threats to documenting historical adaptation patterns, a significantly less urgent but more academically manageable undertaking. Dr. Vasquez began preparing preliminary reports for transmission to New Republic intelligence, summarizing their findings in language that emphasized the natural resilience of oppressed populations rather than evidence of ongoing genetic manipulation programs. The narrative was reassuring in its familiarity. Beings adapted to survive under difficult conditions developed coping mechanisms that served them well under authoritarian rule and would presumably adapt again as democratic institutions took root across the galaxy. Professor Senna found herself relieved to be working within established scientific frameworks rather than confronting evidence of systematic atrocities that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of evil itself. The adaptive compliance explanation allowed her to process their discoveries through conventional academic methodologies, treating them as interesting examples of evolutionary psychology rather than evidence of crimes against the basic nature of consciousness itself. But it was Agent Callus who first articulated the doubts that had been troubling all of them, even as they embraced the more palatable explanation for their findings. During one of their evening briefings, as they reviewed data that seemed to support the natural adaptation hypothesis, he raised questions that none of them wanted to confront, but none of them could ignore. "The timeline doesn't work," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent years analyzing Imperial administrative efficiency. "Natural evolutionary adaptations require multiple generations to become established in a population. But we're seeing these modifications in individuals who were born during the final decade of Imperial rule, some of them in the final years before liberation. Even if selective pressure was extraordinarily intense, natural selection couldn't produce such widespread changes so quickly." The medical droid, when prompted to recalculate the probability of natural adaptation occurring within the observed time frame, produced results that cast serious doubt on their preferred explanation. The genetic changes they had documented would require several centuries of consistent selective pressure to become established through conventional evolutionary processes. The fact that they were observing these changes in a single generation suggested either an unprecedented acceleration of natural selection or deliberate intervention in the population's genetic development. Dr. Vasquez found herself confronting evidence that challenged her desire to believe in the more comfortable explanation. Reviewing the historical records more carefully, she discovered that the timing of genetic modifications correlated not with periods of increased imperial oppression, but with specific administrative initiatives that had been implemented across multiple worlds during the final years of imperial rule. These initiatives had been presented as medical assistance programs, providing genetic screening and treatment for hereditary conditions that affected large portions of planetary populations. The pattern that emerged from this closer analysis was disturbing in its precision. Worlds that had participated in Imperial genetic screening programs showed significantly higher rates of the compliance modifications than worlds that had not. More troubling still, the modifications appeared most frequently in bloodlines that had been identified through these screening programs as carrying genetic markers for leadership potential or exceptional cognitive ability. Professor Senna's academic integrity compelled her to acknowledge that their preferred explanation was becoming increasingly untenable as they gathered more detailed evidence. The modifications they had observed were too systematic, too precisely targeted, and too widespread to represent natural evolutionary adaptation. Moreover, the specific neural pathways affected by these changes suggested sophisticated understanding of neurobiology that went far beyond what random evolutionary pressure could produce. The team's reluctant return to their original hypothesis brought with it a deeper understanding of how easily they had been willing to accept a more comfortable explanation for disturbing evidence. The desire to believe that systematic evil operated within recognizable parameters, that even the Empire's cruelest policies could be understood through conventional frameworks, had made them temporarily blind to evidence that challenged those comforting assumptions. Agent Callus made contact with New Republic intelligence to request access to Imperial administrative archives that might shed light on the genetic screening programs they had identified. The response he received confirmed their worst fears and introduced new complications that would fundamentally alter the scope of their investigation. The genetic screening programs had been coordinated through a special Imperial medical division that reported directly to the Emperor's personal staff, bypassing normal administrative channels and leaving virtually no documentary trail. More disturbing still, intelligence reported that similar screening programs had been implemented on hundreds of worlds across the galaxy, always using the same administrative protocols and always targeting populations with specific genetic markers. The scope of the program suggested resources and coordination capabilities that went far beyond what any single Imperial research division should have possessed. Dr. Vasquez realized that their brief retreat into comfortable explanations had cost them valuable time and had nearly derailed their investigation at a crucial juncture. The false conclusion they had embraced was not simply an academic error, but a demonstration of how even trained researchers could be manipulated by their own desire to believe that evil operated within understandable parameters. The medical droid's reanalysis of their data, conducted without the bias toward natural explanations that had influenced their earlier work, revealed additional evidence that supported the artificial modification hypothesis. The genetic changes showed signs of deliberate design, with backup systems and error correction mechanisms that never appeared in natural evolutionary adaptations. Someone had not simply modified these populations, but had engineered their modifications to be self-sustaining and resistant to therapeutic intervention. As they prepared to leave Malastare and expand their investigation to other worlds, the team carried with them a deeper understanding of the subtle ways that evil could disguise itself as natural phenomena. The Empire's genetic manipulation program had been designed not just to modify populations, but to make those modifications appear natural and inevitable to anyone who discovered them. Their false conclusion had taught them that the most dangerous lies were those that contained enough truth to be believable, that offered explanations that people wanted to accept rather than forcing them to confront uncomfortable realities. The architects of Project Eternal Garden had understood this principle and had built it into their work, creating modifications that could be explained away by researchers who preferred comfortable lies to disturbing truths. The journey ahead would require not just courage to confront evidence of systematic evil, but the intellectual honesty to resist explanations that made that evidence easier to bear. They had learned that understanding the Empire's true legacy would require abandoning their desire for evil to be simple, recognizable, and ultimately defeatable through conventional means. The coordinates that led them to Korriban came from a fragment of data recovered during their final hours on Malastare, buried within medical records that someone had attempted to delete but had failed to completely purge from the planetary archive system. The ancient Sith homeworld had been officially classified as archaeologically protected since the fall of the Empire, its tombs and temples sealed to prevent both looting and the spread of dark side influence. But the coordinates suggested that Imperial research teams had maintained secret access throughout the period of official restriction. Dr. Vasquez stood at the viewport of their research vessel as it dropped out of hyperspace, watching the crimson world rotating slowly against a backdrop of stars that seemed somehow dimmer in this region of space. Korriban had always been more than simply a planet in galactic consciousness. It was a wound in the Force itself, a place where the accumulated malevolence of millennia of Sith Lords had seeped into the very stone and soil, creating an environment where darkness felt natural and light seemed like an uncomfortable intrusion. The approach to Korriban required special clearances from New Republic Archaeological Services, permissions that Agent Kallus had obtained through channels that he preferred not to discuss in detail. The official justification for their visit involved investigating potential connections between ancient Sith practices and Imperial torture methodologies, a research proposal that was technically accurate while concealing the full scope of their investigation into ongoing genetic manipulation programs. Professor Senna found herself experiencing physical discomfort as their ship entered Korriban's atmosphere, a sensation that she initially attributed to the planet's harsh environmental conditions, but gradually recognized as something more fundamental. The academic training that had served her well on other worlds seemed inadequate here, where the very air carried echoes of conversations between beings whose understanding of suffering had transcended mere cruelty and approached a kind of artistic perfection. The medical droid, unaffected by the psychological pressure that seemed to emanate from Korriban's surface, conducted preliminary atmospheric and geological surveys while the organic members of the team struggled with the planet's oppressive psychic weight. Its sensors detected unusual energy signatures throughout the Valley of the Dark Lords, patterns that suggested recent technological activity in areas that should have been undisturbed for decades. Their landing site was a mesa overlooking the valley, chosen for its proximity to several major tomb complexes, while maintaining enough distance to avoid the worst of the dark side energy that concentrated around individual burial sites. From here they could observe the ancient Sith architecture that had served as inspiration for Imperial design aesthetics, the brutal geometric forms that prioritized intimidation over beauty and seemed to have been carved by beings who understood fear as a sculptural medium. Dr. Vasquez began her investigation by reviewing the official archaeological surveys that had been conducted on Korriban since the planet's liberation, looking for discrepancies that might indicate unauthorized research activities. What she discovered was a pattern of irregularities that had been dismissed by previous investigators as equipment malfunctions or data corruption, but which showed clear signs of systematic concealment when analyzed in the context of their broader investigation. Temperature readings that spiked without apparent cause, atmospheric disturbances in areas that should have been stable, and most telling of all, traces of modern technological signatures in tombs that were supposed to contain only ancient artifacts. Someone had been using Korriban's archaeological sites as cover for research activities that they were determined to keep hidden from official scrutiny. Agent Kallus coordinated with their research vessel to deploy surveillance equipment throughout the valley, sensors designed to detect recent human activity and technological signatures that would indicate ongoing operations. The results confirmed their suspicions and revealed something far more disturbing than simple unauthorized research. Multiple tomb complexes showed evidence of regular access over a period of years, with the most recent activity occurring less than a month before their arrival. The implications were staggering. Someone had been conducting research on Korriban throughout the final years of Imperial rule, and had continued that research after the Empire's collapse, using one of the galaxy's most heavily regulated archaeological sites as a base for operations that they were desperate to conceal from both Imperial and New Republic authorities. Professor Senna's analysis of the specific tomb complexes that showed signs of recent activity revealed a pattern that connected their discoveries on Korriban to the genetic modification programs they had identified on other worlds. The sites that had been accessed most frequently were those associated with ancient Sith who had specialized in what historical records termed bloodline manipulation and hereditary enhancement of force sensitivity. The ancient Sith had understood principles of genetic modification that the galaxy's modern scientific establishment was only beginning to rediscover. They had developed techniques for enhancing force sensitivity in their descendants, for creating bloodlines that would carry specific psychological predispositions across generations, and most relevantly for the team's investigation, for modifying the fundamental neural architecture that governed emotional response and moral reasoning. Dr. Vasquez descended into the tomb of Ajunta Pal, the first Dark Lord of the Sith, accompanied by the medical droid and carrying equipment designed to detect both archaeological artifacts and signs of recent technological intrusion. What they discovered there challenged everything they thought they understood about the relationship between ancient Sith practices and modern Imperial research programs. The tomb had been extensively modified since the last official archaeological survey, with modern technological systems integrated into ancient stone architecture in ways that suggested profound understanding of both Sith engineering principles and contemporary genetic research methodologies. Someone had transformed Ajunta Pal's burial chamber into a functional laboratory, one that combined ancient dark side techniques with cutting-edge medical technology. The equipment they found was far more sophisticated than anything they had encountered in their previous investigations, suggesting access to research facilities and technical expertise that went far beyond what Dr. Ivazan could have provided working alone. This was the work of an entire research organization, one that had been operating in secret for years and had access to resources that should not have existed within any known Imperial or post-Imperial structure. Most disturbing of all were the test subjects they discovered in stasis chambers built into alcoves that had once held Sith artifacts. Living beings from multiple species, each one showing signs of genetic modification that represented refinements of the techniques documented in the Project Eternal Garden files. Someone had been using Ajunta Pal's tomb as a testing ground for genetic manipulation programs that made the modifications they had observed on Malastare look primitive by comparison. The medical droid's analysis of the stasis chamber contents revealed modifications that targeted not just behavioral compliance and reduced empathy, but fundamental aspects of consciousness itself. The test subjects showed alterations to neural pathways associated with individual identity, creative thinking, and the capacity for spiritual or philosophical growth. These were not simply techniques for creating compliant populations, but methods for fundamentally redefining what it meant to be a conscious being. Professor Senna found documentation within the laboratory that connected the research being conducted on Korriban to similar facilities on other worlds, a network of hidden research stations that had been operating throughout Imperial space and continued their work even after the Empire's collapse. The scope of the organization behind these facilities was staggering, suggesting resources and coordination capabilities that rivaled those of major governments. But perhaps most troubling of all was the discovery that the research being conducted on Korriban was not simply an extension of Imperial genetic manipulation programs, but represented a fundamental evolution in their approach. Where Project Eternal Garden had focused on creating compliant populations, the work being done in Ajunta Pal's tomb was aimed at something far more ambitious and far more terrible. The documents they recovered spoke of consciousness optimization, of creating beings who retained their technical capabilities and problem-solving abilities. but lost their capacity for the kind of spiritual and philosophical growth that made rebellion possible. The goal was not simply compliance, but the systematic elimination of those aspects of consciousness that had throughout galactic history produced individuals capable of opposing authoritarian systems. Agent Callus coordinated an emergency transmission to New Republic intelligence, requesting immediate support and expanded investigation parameters. The response he received was both encouraging and terrifying. Intelligence services throughout the galaxy had been receiving reports of unusual research activities on worlds that had been thought secure, but no one had connected these reports to a unified program until they received Callus's preliminary findings. As they prepared to leave Korriban and expand their investigation to other sites within the hidden research network, the team carried with them the knowledge that they had uncovered something that threatened not just political freedom, but the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. The Empire's legacy of cruelty had evolved beyond simple sadism into something that challenged the basic assumptions about what made beings capable of growth, creativity, and moral development. The journey ahead would take them deeper into a network of hidden research facilities where ancient Sith knowledge had been combined with modern technology to create weapons that attacked not bodies or minds, but the very essence of what made beings capable of choosing between light and darkness. They had discovered that the ultimate goal of Imperial research was not simply to create perfect subjects, but to redefine the nature of sentient existence itself. The journey from Korriban to Beis took them through hyperspace routes that had been closed to civilian traffic since the Emperor's death. Pathways through the deep core that required navigation codes Agent Callus had obtained through intelligence channels that he described only as complicated and probably temporary. Beis itself had been the Emperor's secret stronghold, a world so thoroughly corrupted by dark side energy that it had become a wound in the Force comparable to Korriban, but focused entirely on Palpatine's particular vision of perfected evil. Dr. Vasquez spent the hyperspace journey reviewing everything New Republic intelligence had been able to gather about Beis since the planet's liberation. What struck her most profoundly was how little concrete information existed about what the Emperor had actually been doing there during the final years of his reign. Official Imperial records described it as a research and development facility, but the specific nature of that research had been classified at levels that even the ISB had rarely encountered. The planet that appeared before them, as they dropped out of hyperspace, bore scars that went far deeper than the physical damage inflicted during its liberation. This hung in space like a sphere of tarnished metal, its surface reflecting light in ways that seemed wrong, as if the very atoms that composed its atmosphere had been corrupted by prolonged exposure to concentrated malevolence. Even viewing it from orbit induced a sense of unease that penetrated their ship's shields and affected organic crew members in subtle but unmistakable ways. Professor Senna had prepared for their investigation by studying every available academic paper on the psychological effects of prolonged exposure to dark side energy, but she found herself unprepared for the intensity of Beis's corrupted atmosphere. The sensation was not simply one of fear or revulsion, but of a fundamental wrongness that seemed to challenge her understanding of how the universe should function. The academic frameworks that had served her well on other worlds felt inadequate when confronted with a place where the Emperor had spent decades perfecting his understanding of systematic evil. Their landing site was a research complex that had been partially destroyed during the liberation, but remained structurally sound enough to serve as a base for their investigation. The facility had been built into the side of a mountain that showed geological signs of having been artificially enhanced to amplify dark side energy, its crystalline formations aligned in patterns that created resonance effects capable of influencing consciousness across vast distances. The medical droid began conducting atmospheric and energy readings as soon as they established their perimeter, its sensors detecting technological signatures that suggested some of the facility's systems remained operational despite years of apparent abandonment. More troubling still, the energy patterns it detected showed signs of recent calibration and maintenance, indicating that someone had been using the facility long after its official closure. Agent Callus established secure communication protocols with New Republic intelligence while deploying surveillance equipment throughout the complex, but found that the planet's corrupted energy field interfered with standard communication systems in ways that suggested deliberate engineering rather than natural phenomena. This had been modified to serve as a fortress not just against physical assault, but against external observation and communication. Dr. Vasquez began her exploration of the facility's accessible areas, finding evidence of research programs that made the genetic manipulation techniques they had documented elsewhere look rudimentary by comparison. The Emperor's personal research had focused on what documentation described as species-wide consciousness modification, techniques for altering not just individual minds, but the fundamental psychological characteristics that defined entire civilizations. The laboratory spaces they discovered contained equipment that combined force amplification technology with genetic engineering systems of unprecedented sophistication. Ancient Sith artifacts had been integrated into modern research apparatus, creating hybrid systems that could manipulate biological processes through dark side energy in ways that conventional science could not detect or counter. Professor Senna found herself grappling with documentation that challenged her understanding of the relationship between technology and the Force. The research conducted on Bicey had not simply used the dark side as a tool for enhancing conventional genetic modification techniques, but had developed entirely new approaches to consciousness manipulation that treated the Force itself as a medium for transmitting psychological modifications across galactic distances. The implications were staggering. The Emperor had not simply been developing techniques for controlling individual planets or star systems, but had been working toward methods of consciousness modification that could be applied to entire species simultaneously, regardless of their physical location. The scope of his ambitions had transcended mere political control and approached something that could only be described as universal psychological domination. But it was the discovery of the facility's central research chamber that revealed the true scope of what the Emperor had been attempting during his final years. The chamber had been built around a massive force-focusing crystal that showed signs of having been artificially corrupted through exposure to concentrated dark side energy over extended periods. The crystal's resonance pattern suggested that it had been used as a transmission system capable of projecting consciousness-altering effects across interstellar distances. The medical droid's analysis of the chamber's technical systems revealed engineering principles that went far beyond anything in the New Republic's scientific databases. The equipment had been designed to amplify and focus the psychological modifications created through genetic manipulation, broadcasting them through the Force to affect populations that had never been directly subjected to biological alteration. This was not simply genetic engineering, but a hybrid of science and dark side sorcery that could modify consciousness on a galactic scale. Dr. Vasquez discovered personal logs recorded by the Emperor himself during his final months, entries that provided terrifying insight into his ultimate goals and the methods he had developed for achieving them. Palpatine spoke with casual confidence about his ability to modify the psychological development of entire species, to eliminate their capacity for rebellion not through force or propaganda, but by fundamentally altering the neural pathways that made independent thought possible. But perhaps most disturbing of all were the Emperor's references to successors and continuation protocols, suggestions that his research had been designed to continue even after his death. The logs spoke of initiated bloodlines and prepared inheritors, individuals who had been specifically modified to carry forward his work and who possessed both the technical knowledge and the Force sensitivity necessary to operate his consciousness modification systems. Agent Callas coordinated emergency communications with New Republic intelligence despite the planet's interference effects, transmitting preliminary findings that prompted immediate deployment of additional investigation teams and military support. The scope of what they had discovered on Bicey represented a threat that went far beyond historical documentation and into the realm of active galactic security concerns. Professor Senna's analysis of the Emperor's research notes revealed connections to similar facilities on other worlds, a network of research stations that had been conducting complementary studies in consciousness modification throughout the final decade of Imperial rule. Each facility had specialized in different aspects of the program, with BICE serving as the central coordination point for a galaxy-spanning project that had been designed to fundamentally alter the nature of sentient consciousness. The team's investigation of BICE's secondary research areas revealed evidence that the consciousness modification programs had been tested on volunteer subjects from across the Empire, individuals who had been selected for their force sensitivity and their willingness to serve as experimental subjects in exchange for promises of enhanced abilities and extended lifespans. The results of these experiments provided a preview of what the Emperor had intended to implement on a universal scale. The test subjects showed modifications that went far beyond simple compliance conditioning or reduced empathy. Their consciousness had been fundamentally restructured to eliminate capacity for spiritual growth, creative thinking, and most importantly, the kind of moral reasoning that made resistance to authoritarian systems possible. They retained their intelligence and technical abilities, but had lost those aspects of consciousness that made them truly alive in any meaningful sense. Dr. Vasquez found herself confronting the horrifying realization that the Emperor's ultimate goal had not been simply to rule the galaxy, but to recreate it in his own image by eliminating from all sentient species those psychological characteristics that he viewed as sources of chaos and unpredictability. His vision of perfect order required the systematic elimination of free will itself, achieved not through external control but through internal modification that made the desire for freedom literally unthinkable. As they prepared to leave Bicey's and continue their investigation, the team carried with them the knowledge that they had uncovered evidence of the most ambitious program of consciousness modification in galactic history. The Emperor's legacy was not simply one of political oppression or military conquest, but of a systematic assault on the fundamental nature of sentient consciousness that continued to operate through hidden networks and prepared inheritors. The journey ahead would require them to confront not just the technical aspects of consciousness modification, but the philosophical implications of evil so sophisticated that it could eliminate its own opposition by redefining the nature of consciousness itself. They had discovered that the Empire's true weapon had not been the Death Star or the Imperial fleet, but a systematic program designed to make rebellion not just difficult but psychologically impossible. The encrypted databank they discovered buried beneath Bicey's primary research facility contained information that transformed their understanding of Imperial genetic manipulation from a series of isolated experiments into evidence of the most comprehensive assault on free will in galactic history. Dr. Vasquez stood in the sterile glow of the underground chamber, watching as terabytes of classified data streamed across holographic displays that had been hidden beneath tons of reinforced durasteel and energy shielding, designed to survive planetary bombardment. The sheer scope of what they were uncovering defied comprehension. Project Eternal Garden, which they had initially believed to be the Emperor's primary genetic modification program, was revealed to be merely one component of a much larger initiative called the Contingency. This overarching project had been divided into dozens of specialized sub-programs, each focusing on different aspects of consciousness modification, and each operating with complete independence from the others, to ensure that the discovery of any single component would not compromise the entire operation. Professor Senna found herself struggling to process documentation that detailed genetic modification programs spanning hundreds of worlds and affecting billions of individuals across multiple species. The Empire had not simply been conducting experiments in population control, but had been systematically reshaping the evolutionary trajectory of galactic civilization itself. Each sub-program had targeted different aspects of consciousness, from basic emotional responses to the complex neural pathways that governed moral reasoning and creative thinking. Agent Callus coordinated with their research vessel to establish secure communication links with New Republic intelligence, but the magnitude of what they were discovering overwhelmed standard reporting protocols. The evidence they were uncovering suggested that virtually every major population center in the former Empire had been subjected to some form of genetic modification, with techniques ranging from subtle behavioral conditioning to fundamental alterations of consciousness itself. The medical droid's analysis of the genetic modification techniques documented in the databank revealed a level of sophistication that challenged basic assumptions about what was scientifically possible using available technology. The Imperial researchers had not simply been enhancing existing genetic engineering methods, but had developed entirely new approaches that combined biological manipulation with force-based consciousness modification in ways that conventional science could not detect or reverse. Dr. Vasquez discovered that the contingency had been designed with multiple layers of redundancy and fail-safe mechanisms that would ensure its continuation, even if the Empire itself was completely destroyed. The genetic modifications implemented through various sub-programs had been engineered to activate and spread autonomously over time, creating self-perpetuating changes that would become more pronounced in each successive generation, rather than fading through natural genetic drift. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the revelation that the contingency had not been limited to genetic modification of Imperial subjects. The databank contained evidence of programs designed to infiltrate and modify populations throughout the galaxy, including worlds that had never been under direct Imperial control. Rebel Alliance strongholds, neutral systems, and even core world populations that had maintained their independence throughout the Imperial period showed evidence of exposure to contingency modification programs. The techniques used for these external operations were more subtle than those employed within Imperial space, relying on contaminated medical supplies, modified food distribution systems, and even atmospheric dispersal methods that could introduce genetic modification agents into planetary ecosystems without detection. The scope of these operations suggested resources and coordination capabilities that went far beyond what the Empire's official military and administrative structure should have been able to support. Professor Senna's analysis of the program's organizational structure revealed that the contingency had been coordinated through a shadow network that operated independently of normal Imperial command hierarchies. This network included not only Imperial officials and researchers, but also individuals from academic institutions, medical organizations, and commercial enterprises throughout the galaxy who had been recruited or coerced into supporting the program without understanding its ultimate goals. The financial records contained within the databank showed that the contingency had been funded through a complex web of shell corporations, hidden accounts, and redirected Imperial resources that had allowed it to operate with virtually unlimited budgets while maintaining complete secrecy from even high-ranking Imperial officials. The program had been structured as a series of apparently legitimate research initiatives and medical assistance programs that provided perfect cover for systematic genetic manipulation on a galactic scale. Agent Callus discovered evidence that several prominent figures within the New Republic government had been subjected to contingency modification programs during their youth, including individuals who now held key positions in intelligence services and medical research organizations. The implications were staggering, suggesting that the Empire's genetic modification programs were still influencing galactic politics through individuals who had no knowledge of their own conditioning. Dr. Vasquez found personal files that documented the psychological profiles and modification protocols applied to thousands of individuals who had later become prominent figures in various fields throughout the galaxy. Scientists, politicians, military officers, and even some Jedi who had survived the Purge showed evidence of having been subjected to subtle genetic modifications that would influence their decision-making processes and behavioral patterns in ways that served Imperial interests even after the Empire's collapse. The medical droid's detailed analysis of these individual modification protocols revealed that the contingency's architects had possessed sophisticated understanding of how genetic changes could be used to influence personality development and ideological orientation. The modifications were designed not to create obvious changes in behavior, but to subtly bias individuals toward accepting authoritarian solutions to complex problems and to feel uncomfortable with situations that required independent moral judgment. But the most chilling discovery came when Professor Senna identified patterns in the modification data that suggested the contingency had been designed to produce specific outcomes in the post-Imperial period. The genetic changes that had been introduced into various populations were not random experiments, but carefully calculated modifications that would create social and political conditions favorable to the emergence of new authoritarian systems following the Empire's eventual collapse. The databank contained predictive models that demonstrated remarkable accuracy in forecasting post-imperial political developments based on the distribution of genetic modifications across different populations and regions. The Empire's researchers had not simply been trying to maintain imperial control, but had been engineering the social conditions that would make the galaxy vulnerable to new forms of authoritarian control even after the Empire itself was completely destroyed. Dr. Vasquez discovered evidence that similar genetic modification programs had been conducted throughout galactic history by previous Sith organizations, suggesting that the contingency represented not an Imperial innovation, but the latest iteration of techniques that had been refined over millennia. Ancient Sith Lords had understood that lasting control required modification of their subjects' fundamental psychology rather than simple military dominance, and they had developed increasingly sophisticated methods for achieving this goal across successive generations. The revelation that genetic modification had been used as a tool of political control throughout galactic history forced the team to reconsider their understanding of major historical events and social movements. Wars, revolutions, and political transitions that had been interpreted as natural developments now appeared to show signs of having been influenced by systematic consciousness modification programs that had been operating beneath the surface of recorded history. Agent Callus coordinated emergency briefings with New Republic intelligence leadership, transmitting preliminary findings that prompted immediate security reviews of key government personnel and medical facilities. The possibility that contingency modifications were still active within New Republic institutions represented a threat to galactic security that required immediate and comprehensive response at the highest levels of government. The team's investigation of the contingency's continuation protocols revealed that the program had been designed to operate autonomously for decades after the Empire's collapse, with activation triggers and expansion mechanisms that would cause the genetic modifications to become more pronounced over time. The Empire's defeat had not ended the threat, but had simply initiated the next phase of a program designed to reshape galactic civilization according to Imperial ideological principles. As they prepared to transmit their findings and expand their investigation to other contingency sites, the team faced the sobering realization that they had uncovered evidence of the most ambitious and successful assault on free will in galactic history. The Empire's true legacy was not its military conquests or political oppression, but a systematic program of consciousness modification that continued to influence galactic civilization through victims who would never know what had been done to them. The breakthrough that connected centuries of galactic conflict to systematic consciousness modification came from an unlikely source. While analyzing the deepest archives within Bessie's underground facility, Professor Senna discovered references to research conducted not during Palpatine's reign, but during the final years of the Old Republic, decades before the Clone Wars had provided cover for the Empire's rise to power. These references led to a hidden subsection of the databank that contained historical records spanning nearly 1,000 years of continuous genetic modification programs. Dr. Vasquez felt the foundations of her historical understanding crumble as she reviewed documentation that revealed the Ruusan Reformation, the period that had supposedly ended the conflict between Jedi and Sith, had actually marked the beginning of a new phase in Sith strategy. Rather than continuing to seek power through direct confrontation, the surviving Sith Lords had initiated programs designed to gradually modify the psychological development of galactic civilization itself, creating conditions that would eventually make authoritarian control seem natural and inevitable. The scale of this historical revelation defied comprehension. Every major political crisis of the past millennium showed signs of having been engineered or amplified through systematic consciousness modification of key populations. The Stark Hyperspace War, the Khans disorders, the Mandalorian Wars, even the sectarian conflicts that had plagued the Mid-Rim for generations, all displayed patterns consistent with populations that had been subjected to genetic modifications designed to increase aggression, reduce empathy, and eliminate capacity for peaceful conflict resolution. Agent Kallus coordinated with New Republic intelligence to cross-reference their findings with historical databases maintained by the Jedi archives on Coruscant. The results confirmed their worst suspicions and revealed new dimensions of the conspiracy they were uncovering. Jedi records from the Old Republic period contained references to corruption of bloodlines and hereditary darkness that had been dismissed by modern historians as metaphorical language, but now appeared to describe actual genetic modification programs. The medical droid's analysis of historical genetic data revealed modification patterns that had been gradually accumulating in galactic populations for centuries, with each major conflict serving as an opportunity to introduce new modifications or enhance existing ones. The Clone Wars, in particular, had provided perfect cover for massive genetic modification programs that had affected entire star systems through contaminated medical supplies and modified clone trooper genetic material. Professor Senna discovered evidence that the clone army itself had been designed not simply as a military force, but as a delivery system for genetic modification agents that would affect populations throughout the galaxy. The rapid deployment of clone troopers to thousands of worlds had provided unprecedented access to planetary populations, allowing Imperial researchers to introduce consciousness modification programs on a scale that would have been impossible through conventional means. Dr. Vasquez found herself confronting the horrifying realization that the Clone Wars had not been a tragic conflict between opposing political philosophies, but a carefully orchestrated program designed to provide cover for the most comprehensive assault on free will in galactic history. The war had served multiple purposes, eliminating the Jedi as an obstacle to Sith plans, while simultaneously providing access to populations across the galaxy for systematic genetic modification. The databank contained detailed records of how specific battles and campaigns had been designed to maximize opportunities for genetic modification of civilian populations. Medical relief efforts, refugee assistance programs, and post-conflict reconstruction initiatives had all been structured to provide cover for introducing modification agents into populations that had been identified as possessing psychological characteristics that made them resistant to authoritarian control. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the revelation that the genetic modifications introduced during the Clone Wars had been designed with temporal activation mechanisms that would cause their effects to become more pronounced over time. The generation born during and after the Clone Wars carried genetic modifications that were only now reaching full activation, creating populations with dramatically reduced capacity for independent moral reasoning and increased susceptibility to authoritarian influence. Agent Kallus made the connection between these temporal activation patterns and political developments across the galaxy since the Empire's fall. Worlds that showed the highest concentrations of Clone Wars-era genetic modifications also displayed the most troubling trends toward authoritarian governance structures within New Republic territories. Democratic institutions were failing not due to external pressure or economic crisis, but because entire populations had been bred to find democratic decision-making psychologically uncomfortable. The investigation took on new urgency when Dr. Vasquez discovered evidence that the genetic modification programs had not ended with the Empire's collapse, but had continued under new organizational structures that had been established as fail-safes against Imperial defeat. These continuation programs were being coordinated through apparently legitimate academic and medical institutions that had maintained the research infrastructure and personnel necessary to keep the contingency operational. Professor Senna's analysis of contemporary genetic modification research revealed that several prominent universities and medical research institutes throughout New Republic space were conducting studies that served as cover for ongoing contingency operations. The research was presented as efforts to understand and reverse Imperial genetic modifications, but the actual work being conducted was designed to enhance and refine those modifications for more effective implementation in future generations. The medical droid identified specific research institutions that showed patterns of activity consistent with active genetic modification programs, including facilities on Coruscant, Chandrila, and Bothawui, that had been conducting large-scale genetic screening programs supposedly designed to identify and treat Imperial-era modifications. These programs were actually identifying individuals who had retained natural resistance to consciousness modification and subjecting them to enhanced treatment protocols designed to eliminate that resistance. Dr. Vasquez discovered personal communications between researchers at these institutions that revealed the scope of their ongoing work and their confidence in its ultimate success. They spoke with casual enthusiasm about their progress in eliminating what they termed cognitive dissonance patterns and ethical reasoning anomalies from galactic populations, treating natural human capacities for moral judgment and independent thinking as medical conditions requiring treatment. The team's investigation revealed that the continuation programs had been structured to operate through multiple generations, with each phase designed to build upon the modifications introduced by previous phases. The ultimate goal was not simply to create compliant populations, but to fundamentally redefine consciousness itself by eliminating those aspects of sentient psychology that made resistance to authoritarian control possible. Agent Callus coordinated emergency communications with the highest levels of New Republic government, transmitting findings that prompted immediate security reviews and investigations of the research institutions they had identified. The response revealed that several key figures within New Republic medical and academic hierarchies had been under investigation for unauthorized research activities, but the scope of the conspiracy had been vastly underestimated. But the most chilling discovery came when Professor Senna identified evidence that the genetic modification programs were being coordinated by individuals who had been specifically bred and conditioned for this purpose over multiple generations. These hereditary administrators possessed both the technical knowledge and the psychological conditioning necessary to continue the programs indefinitely, viewing their work not as a betrayal of galactic freedom, but as a necessary step in the evolution of consciousness itself. Dr. Vasquez found documentation that revealed these hereditary administrators had been placed in key positions throughout galactic society, not just within research institutions but in government agencies, military organizations, and even some Jedi training facilities. Their modifications were so subtle that they appeared to be naturally gifted individuals who had risen to positions of influence through merit, but their psychological conditioning ensured that they would unconsciously work to advance the contingency's goals regardless of their official responsibilities. The revelation that the genetic modification conspiracy included individuals within the New Republic government and Jedi Order represented a threat that went far beyond historical documentation and into the realm of active galactic security crisis. The Empire's legacy was not simply a matter of past atrocities, but an ongoing assault on the fundamental nature of consciousness itself that continued to operate through victims who had been bred specifically to perpetuate it. As they prepared to expand their investigation to identify and expose the hereditary administrators, the team faced the sobering realization that they were confronting not simply the aftermath of Imperial cruelty, but an active conspiracy that had been operating for centuries and had penetrated every level of galactic civilization. The true scope of the Empire's evil was only beginning to become clear, and the battle for the galaxy's future would be fought not on traditional battlefields, but within the genetic code and psychological conditioning of billions of beings who had no idea what had been done to them. The secure facility on Chandrila, where they assembled their coalition of witnesses, experts, and survivors, had once served as a meditation retreat for Jedi who sought to understand the deeper mysteries of the Force. Now it hosted the most comprehensive gathering of individuals dedicated to exposing and countering the galaxy's longest-running conspiracy, bringing together beings whose lives had been shaped by genetic modification programs they were only now beginning to understand. Dr. Vasquez found herself serving as coordinator for discussions that challenged every assumption about the nature of consciousness, free will, and the relationship between biological inheritance and moral development. The beings who had answered their call included geneticists who had discovered anomalous patterns in their research, political leaders who had noticed unusual behavioral trends in their populations, and most importantly, individuals who had begun to recognize the effects of modification within themselves. Among their most valuable contributors was Master Tian Solusar, a Jedi historian who had been investigating references to bloodline corruption in ancient Jedi texts without understanding their literal accuracy. Her research into Force-sensitive bloodlines had revealed patterns of psychological modification that stretched back through centuries of carefully documented family histories, showing how specific genetic lines had been systematically altered to reduce Force sensitivity and eliminate the capacity for the kind of moral reasoning that made Jedi training possible. Professor Senna coordinated testimony from academic researchers across the galaxy who had been studying what they believed were natural evolutionary adaptations in various species, only to discover that these adaptations showed clear signs of artificial modification when analyzed using techniques developed during their investigation. The scope of academic fields that had been unknowingly documenting genetic modification programs was staggering, encompassing anthropology, psychology, evolutionary biology, and even philosophical studies of moral development across different cultures. Agent Callus presented evidence gathered by New Republic intelligence services that revealed the depth of infiltration by hereditary administrators within government and military institutions. The pattern that emerged was one of systematic placement of modified individuals in positions where they could influence policy decisions, resource allocation, and strategic planning in ways that served the contingency's long-term objectives while appearing to advance legitimate governmental interests. The medical droid served as a neutral facilitator for discussions that became increasingly emotional as participants began to understand the personal implications of what they were uncovering. Its clinical perspective proved invaluable in maintaining focus on technical details, while organic participants struggled with the realization that their most fundamental assumptions about consciousness, identity, and moral agency had been shaped by systematic manipulation spanning multiple generations. Dr. Bail Prester Organa, who had arrived on Chandrila despite the security risks involved in his participation, contributed documentation from Alderaan's archives that had survived the planet's destruction. These records revealed that Alderaanian medical and educational institutions had been specifically targeted by genetic modification programs designed to eliminate the planetary culture's emphasis on peaceful conflict resolution and democratic governance, characteristics that had made Alderaan a persistent obstacle to Imperial expansion. The discussions that emerged from these diverse perspectives painted a picture of systematic consciousness modification that challenged basic assumptions about individual identity and moral responsibility. Participants found themselves grappling with questions that had no easy answers about the relationship between genetic inheritance, psychological conditioning, and personal accountability for choices made under the influence of artificial modifications. Master Solus's analysis of Force-sensitive bloodlines revealed that the genetic modifications had been specifically designed to eliminate Force sensitivity in populations that showed natural resistance to authoritarian control. The Empire had understood that Force-sensitive individuals posed a unique threat to consciousness modification programs because their connection to the Force provided them with intuitive awareness of artificial psychological influences that normal individuals could not detect. The gathering included survivors of specific modification programs who had retained enough natural psychological resilience to recognize the artificial nature of their conditioning. Their testimonies provided crucial insight into the subjective experience of genetic modification, describing feelings of psychological dissonance and moral confusion that they had attributed to personal inadequacies until learning about the contingency's existence. Dr. Vasquez coordinated efforts to establish a comprehensive database of genetic modification techniques, affected populations, and continuation program activities that could serve as a resource for future research and counter-modification efforts. The scope of information they were processing required development of new analytical frameworks and documentation methods that could handle data spanning centuries of systematic consciousness manipulation. Professor Senna established working groups focused on developing educational materials that could help individuals recognize the effects of genetic modification within themselves and their communities. These materials needed to be sophisticated enough to provide accurate information while remaining accessible to populations whose capacity for complex moral reasoning had been systematically compromised through the very modifications they were designed to address. The testimony from modified individuals revealed psychological effects that were more subtle and more comprehensive than the team's technical analysis had suggested. The modifications didn't simply reduce empathy or increase compliance, but fundamentally altered the subjective experience of moral decision-making, making ethical choices feel uncomfortable or unnatural while creating psychological satisfaction from following authoritarian directives. Agent Callus coordinated intelligence-sharing arrangements with security services throughout New Republic space, establishing protocols for identifying and monitoring hereditary administrators while avoiding the kind of persecution that would undermine democratic principles. The challenge was enormous, requiring methods for detecting and countering genetic modification programs without creating the kind of authoritarian surveillance state that the contingency was designed to promote. The medical experts in attendance developed preliminary protocols for genetic screening that could identify modification markers without alerting continuation program operators to their detection methods. These protocols needed to be sophisticated enough to distinguish between natural genetic variations and artificial modifications, while remaining simple enough to be implemented by medical facilities with limited resources and technical expertise. Master Solus contributed insights from Jedi meditation techniques that could potentially help individuals recognize and resist the psychological effects of genetic modification, though she cautioned that such techniques required levels of self-awareness and mental discipline that might not be achievable by individuals whose capacity for introspection had been systematically compromised. The philosophical discussions that emerged from their gathering addressed fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness and moral agency in the context of systematic genetic modification. Participants found themselves debating whether individuals who had been modified retained moral responsibility for their actions, and what obligations society had toward both the victims and perpetrators of consciousness modification programs. Dr. Vasquez facilitated working sessions focused on developing counter-modification techniques that could potentially reverse or mitigate the effects of genetic modifications without creating new forms of consciousness manipulation. The ethical challenges involved in such work were enormous, requiring careful consideration of issues related to consent, identity, and the right of individuals to maintain their existing psychological characteristics, even if those characteristics had been artificially imposed. The gathering concluded with the establishment of a permanent coalition dedicated to exposing and countering genetic modification programs while supporting individuals and communities affected by consciousness manipulation. This coalition would need to operate with extreme discretion to avoid triggering defensive responses from continuation program operators while building the resources and expertise necessary to address a threat that had been developing for centuries. As participants prepared to return to their various roles throughout the galaxy, they carried with them the sobering knowledge that the battle for galactic freedom would need to be fought not only in political and military arenas, but within the genetic code and psychological conditioning that shaped the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. The Empire's true legacy was revealed to be not its military conquests or political oppression, but a systematic assault on the essence of what made beings capable of choosing between good and evil. The coordinates that would lead them to the heart of the contingency's operations came from an unexpected source. During the final hours of their gathering on Chandrila, Master Tayan Solasa had experienced what she described as a force vision, a sudden overwhelming sense of direction that pulled her consciousness toward a region of space that official star charts listed as uninhabited and strategically worthless. The vision had been accompanied by images of ancient technology and the sound of voices speaking in languages that predated the establishment of the Galactic Republic. Dr. Vasquez found herself grappling with the implications of using mystical guidance to direct what had been a rigorously scientific investigation, but the alternatives were increasingly limited. Their systematic analysis of genetic modification patterns had revealed the existence of coordination centers that should be detectable through conventional means, yet every attempt to locate these facilities through traditional intelligence gathering had met with failure that seemed too comprehensive to be coincidental. Professor Senna coordinated the team's departure from Chandrila with unprecedented security measures, understanding that their investigation had moved beyond academic research into active opposition to forces that had demonstrated their willingness to eliminate threats to their operations. The coalition they had assembled would continue its work throughout the galaxy, but the core team faced a journey that would take them beyond the protection of New Republic space and into regions where the contingency's influence might be absolute. Agent Callus established communication protocols with New Republic intelligence that would allow them to transmit their findings even if they did not survive their investigation, ensuring that the evidence they had gathered would reach appropriate authorities, regardless of what they encountered at their destination. The precautions felt both necessary and ominous, acknowledging the possibility that they were traveling toward a confrontation that they might not survive. The journey to the coordinates provided by Master Solus's vision required passage through hyperspace routes that had been officially closed since the Clone Wars, navigational paths that led through regions of space where gravitational anomalies and subspace disturbances made safe travel nearly impossible. The medical droid calculated that their route would take them through areas where the fabric of space itself showed signs of having been artificially modified, distortions that suggested the presence of technology beyond anything in conventional databases. As their research vessel emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Maw cluster, the team found themselves confronting a sight that challenged their understanding of what was scientifically possible. The gravitational anomalies that made the region dangerous to navigation had been harnessed and controlled, creating stable corridors through what should have been chaotic space and providing access to installations that existed in regions that conventional physics suggested should be uninhabitable. Dr. Vasquez observed the installations through their ship's enhanced sensors, watching structures that combined architectural elements from dozens of different species and historical periods. The facilities appeared to have been built over centuries, with each expansion incorporating design principles and construction techniques from different eras of galactic development. The overall effect was one of organic growth rather than planned construction, as if the installations had evolved rather than been designed. The energy signatures emanating from the installations were unlike anything in their technical databases, suggesting power sources that operated on principles that combined conventional technology with force manipulation in ways that should not have been possible. The readings indicated that the facilities were drawing energy not just from local stellar sources, but from the Force itself, creating sustainable power systems that could operate indefinitely without external fuel sources. Professor Senna coordinated passive scanning operations designed to gather intelligence about the installations without alerting their inhabitants to the research team's presence. What they discovered suggested that the facilities served as coordination centers for genetic modification programs spanning multiple galactic sectors, with communication networks that reached across vast distances and maintained real-time coordination with research stations throughout known space. The medical droid's analysis of biological signatures detected within the installations revealed the presence of thousands of individuals from multiple species, but with genetic patterns that showed systematic modification far beyond anything they had encountered in their previous investigations. The inhabitants appeared to have been extensively modified not just psychologically but physically, creating beings whose biological capabilities exceeded natural limitations while retaining the appearance of normal members of their respective species. Agent Callis established surveillance positions that would allow them to observe the installation's activities without approaching close enough to trigger defensive systems that his sensors had identified throughout the region. The facilities were protected by technology that appeared to blend conventional weapon systems with force-based defensive mechanisms, creating security perimeters that could respond to both physical and psychic intrusions. As they observed the installations over several days, patterns of activity emerged that suggested the facilities served not just as research centers, but as training grounds for individuals who would be deployed throughout the galaxy to continue the contingency's work. Ships arrived and departed on regular schedules, carrying passengers whose genetic signatures indicated they had been extensively modified during their stays at the facilities. Dr. Vasquez found herself confronting the realization that they were observing the operational heart of a conspiracy that had been shaping galactic civilization for centuries. The installations represented not just research facilities, but the administrative center of an organization that had successfully infiltrated every major political, academic, and cultural institution across known space while maintaining complete secrecy about its existence and objectives. The team's observations revealed that the facilities operated according to protocols that suggested they were preparing for a major expansion of their operations. Construction activities indicated that new research wings were being added to existing installations, while communication traffic suggested coordination with sleeper agents and hereditary administrators throughout New Republic space who were receiving activation orders and new operational parameters. Master Solasar, maintaining a force-based meditation routine designed to gather intelligence without alerting the installation's force-sensitive inhabitants to her presence, reported sensing psychological emanations that confirmed their worst fears about the scope of the contingency's ultimate objectives. The beings within the facilities were not simply conducting research or coordinating existing operations, but were preparing to implement the final phase of a program designed to eliminate free will from galactic civilization entirely. The meditation sessions also revealed that the installations served as repositories for knowledge and techniques that had been accumulated over millennia of consciousness modification research. Ancient Sith Lords, Imperial researchers, and contemporary scientists had all contributed to databases that represented the most comprehensive understanding of consciousness manipulation in galactic history. Information that was being used to develop techniques that would make previous modification programs seem primitive by comparison. Professor Senna's analysis of the installation's communication patterns revealed coordination with facilities on worlds throughout the galaxy that had been assumed to be legitimate research institutions. Universities, medical centers, and government agencies that the New Republic relied upon for scientific and medical expertise were receiving detailed instructions for implementing modification programs that would affect entire planetary populations within a single generation. As they prepared for the infiltration that would allow them to gather definitive proof of the contingency's activities and ultimate objectives, the team faced the sobering realization that they were confronting not simply a criminal conspiracy, but an organization that possessed resources, knowledge, and capabilities that rivaled those of major galactic governments. The installations they were preparing to enter represented the culmination of centuries of careful planning and resource accumulation by beings whose commitment to their objectives transcended normal considerations of morality, legality, or even survival. Dr. Vasquez coordinated final preparations for an infiltration that would either provide them with the evidence needed to expose and counter the contingency's operations, or would result in their discovery and elimination by forces that had successfully maintained their secrecy for longer than the Galactic Republic had existed. The stakes could not have been higher, and the likelihood of survival could not have been lower. But the alternative was allowing the systematic elimination of free will to proceed unopposed until no beings in the galaxy retained the capacity to recognize what had been done to them. The infiltration of the primary installation required precision that bordered on impossibility, threading their research vessel through gravitational fields that had been artificially modified to create a maze of safe passages known only to authorized personnel. Dr. Vasquez guided their approach using navigation data that Master Solisa had obtained through Force-enhanced perception, following routes that existed more as possibilities within the Force than as physical pathways through conventional space. What they discovered within the installation's central complex challenged every assumption they had developed about the nature and scope of the contingency. The facility was not simply a research center or coordination hub, but a vast repository of consciousness itself, containing the preserved minds and memories of thousands of beings who had contributed to genetic modification research across multiple centuries. Ancient Sith Lords existed alongside Imperial scientists and contemporary researchers in a form of technological immortality that allowed them to continue their work indefinitely. Professor Senna found herself walking through corridors lined with crystalline storage matrices that contained the complete consciousness patterns of beings whose physical bodies had died generations ago. The technology that maintained these preserved minds was unlike anything in galactic databases, combining force manipulation with quantum consciousness transfer techniques that should not have been possible using available scientific principles. The preserved consciousness of Darth Plagueis occupied the installation's central chamber, his mind sustained within a crystalline matrix that pulsed with dark side energy, while interfacing with technological systems that controlled genetic modification programs throughout the galaxy. His consciousness had been preserved at the moment of his physical death, allowing him to continue his research into the manipulation of life itself while coordinating the systematic modification of galactic civilization. Agent Callus discovered communication arrays that maintained real-time contact with hereditary administrators and sleeper agents throughout New Republic space, revealing the true scope of the contingency's infiltration of galactic society. Government officials, military officers, academic researchers, and even some Jedi had been either modified or replaced by agents whose psychological conditioning made them perfect servants of the contingency's objectives, while appearing to be loyal citizens of their respective institutions. The medical droid's analysis of the facility's research capabilities revealed projects that went far beyond genetic modification to encompass fundamental alterations of consciousness itself. The researchers, both living and preserved, were developing techniques for transferring consciousness between bodies, creating artificial force sensitivity in non-sensitive individuals, and most disturbing of all, eliminating the capacity for independent thought while maintaining the appearance of normal cognitive function. Dr. Vasquez accessed data terminals that contained the complete historical record of the contingency's operations, documentation that revealed the true scope of their influence over galactic events spanning nearly 2 millennia. Every major conflict, political crisis, and social transformation since the establishment of the Galactic Republic showed signs of having been engineered or amplified through systematic consciousness modification of key populations and individuals. The preserved consciousness of Emperor Palpatine occupied a secondary chamber, his mind interfacing with systems that coordinated the post-Imperial phase of the contingency's operations. His death aboard the second Death Star had been anticipated and planned for, allowing his consciousness to continue directing genetic modification programs through technological immortality, while his physical destruction provided cover for the next phase of operations. Master Solusar encountered the preserved mind of an ancient Jedi Master who had been captured and modified centuries earlier, his consciousness altered to serve the contingency's objectives, while retaining his Force abilities and knowledge of Jedi techniques. This corrupted Jedi consciousness had been instrumental in developing methods for identifying and eliminating Force-sensitive individuals who showed resistance to genetic modification programs. The revelation that emerged from their exploration of the facility's deepest archives was that the contingency had not been content to modify existing consciousness, but had been working toward the creation of entirely artificial forms of sentient life that would be incapable of developing the psychological characteristics that made rebellion possible. These artificial beings would possess all the cognitive abilities necessary for technological and cultural advancement, while lacking the capacity for moral reasoning that had throughout galactic history produced individuals capable of opposing authoritarian systems. Professor Senna discovered prototype artificial consciousnesses that represented the culmination of millennia of research into the nature of sentient thought. These artificial minds possessed remarkable intelligence and creativity, but their psychological architecture had been designed to make certain forms of thinking literally impossible. They could not conceive of alternatives to existing authority structures, could not experience emotional connections that might motivate resistance to unjust orders, and could not develop the kind of spiritual or philosophical insights that had traditionally inspired movements for social change. The facility's central processing systems revealed that the contingency was preparing to implement what they termed the final integration, a galaxy-wide deployment of consciousness modification techniques that would affect every sentient being simultaneously. The deployment would be coordinated through the existing network of research institutions, medical facilities, and government agencies that had been infiltrated over centuries of careful planning. Agent Callus accessed communication logs that revealed the timeline for final integration, showing that implementation was scheduled to begin within months and would be completed within a single generation. The modification techniques had been refined to the point where they could be delivered through atmospheric dispersal, food contamination, and even direct force manipulation, making resistance virtually impossible once the deployment began. Dr. Vasquez found personal logs recorded by the preserved consciousness of Darth Plagueis that revealed the philosophical justification for the contingency's work. The ancient Sith Lord spoke with casual confidence about his belief that consciousness as it existed naturally was fundamentally flawed, prone to chaos and unpredictability that made stable galactic civilization impossible. His work was designed not to destroy consciousness but to perfect it by eliminating those aspects that led to conflict and suffering. The preserved mind of Emperor Palpatine had contributed his own philosophical framework to the contingency's objectives, arguing that true peace could only be achieved through the elimination of free will itself. His vision of galactic order required beings who could function effectively within technological civilization while lacking the psychological capacity to question or resist the authority structures that governed their lives. But perhaps most chilling of all was the discovery that the contingency had developed techniques for consciousness transfer that would allow the preserved minds of its architects to inhabit new bodies indefinitely, ensuring that their work would continue across multiple lifetimes while they retained the accumulated knowledge and experience of centuries of research. The ancient evil that had initiated the program would never truly die, but would continue to refine and expand its influence through an endless succession of physical incarnations. The team's exploration of the facility's deepest levels revealed preparation chambers where thousands of bodies were being modified to serve as hosts for consciousness transfer, creating a supply of physical forms that could house the preserved minds of Sith Lords and Imperial researchers for millennia to come. These bodies had been genetically optimized for longevity and enhanced capabilities, while remaining indistinguishable from normal members of their respective species. Master Solusar discovered that the facility contained detailed plans for the post-integration galaxy, blueprints for a civilization where technological and cultural advancement would continue under the guidance of beings whose consciousness had been perfected through artificial modification. This new galactic order would be peaceful, productive, and utterly incapable of the kind of independent moral reasoning that had throughout history produced heroes capable of opposing systematic evil. As they prepared to escape the facility and transmit their findings to the coalition they had assembled, the team faced the horrifying realization that they had uncovered not simply a criminal conspiracy, but the culmination of a millennia-long project to fundamentally redefine the nature of consciousness itself. The galaxy they were fighting to preserve was only months away from transformation into something that would retain the appearance of civilization while eliminating everything that made sentient life meaningful. The escape from the contingency's central facility required sacrifices that would haunt the survivors for the remainder of their lives. Master Tion Solusar remained behind to ensure that their research vessel could navigate the artificially modified gravitational fields surrounding the installation, using her connection to the Force to create a safe passage while the facility's security systems activated in response to their intrusion. Her final transmission spoke of sensing something beyond the darkness they had encountered, a presence within the Force that had been working in opposition to the contingency for centuries and would continue that opposition even after her physical death. Dr. Vasquez coordinated the transmission of their findings to coalition members throughout the galaxy, while their ship fought its way through space distortions that seemed designed to prevent any information from leaving the region. The data they had gathered represented not just evidence of the contingency's existence and objectives, but detailed technical specifications for consciousness modification techniques and comprehensive lists of infiltrated institutions that could serve as the foundation for organized resistance. The response to their transmissions exceeded their most optimistic expectations. Coalition members across the galaxy coordinated simultaneous operations against research facilities, government installations, and academic institutions that had been identified as contingency assets. The scope of the response revealed that resistance to consciousness modification had been building throughout galactic society, waiting only for confirmation of the threat's existence and coordinates for effective action. Professor Senna established communication links with resistance cells that had been operating independently on dozens of worlds, groups of individuals who had recognized the artificial nature of their psychological conditioning and had been working to develop counter-modification techniques. These cells had been conducting their own research into genetic modification patterns, developing treatments that could potentially reverse or mitigate the effects of consciousness manipulation while preserving the essential identity of affected individuals. Agent Callus coordinated military operations with New Republic defense forces that targeted the contingency's communication networks and transportation systems, disrupting coordination between research facilities and preventing the deployment of final integration modification agents. The military response benefited from intelligence provided by hereditary administrators who had discovered the artificial nature of their conditioning and had chosen to oppose the organization they had been bred to serve. The medical droid served as a central repository for information about consciousness modification techniques and counter-modification treatments, its databases becoming the foundation for a galaxy-wide medical response to the contingency's effects. Medical facilities throughout New Republic space began implementing screening protocols designed to identify and treat individuals who had been subjected to genetic modification, while research institutions developed new techniques for detecting and countering artificial psychological conditioning. But the most significant aspect of the resistance that emerged was philosophical rather than technical. Beings throughout the galaxy began to recognize that the capacity for independent moral reasoning was not simply a personal characteristic, but the fundamental basis of everything that made sentient existence meaningful. The threat to consciousness itself had awakened awareness of consciousness as something precious that required active protection and cultivation. Dr. Vasquez found herself at the center of efforts to document and preserve traditional forms of consciousness that had been targeted by the contingency's modification programs. Her historical training proved invaluable in identifying and cataloging the psychological characteristics that had been systematically eliminated from modified populations, creating a comprehensive record of what needed to be restored to return galactic civilization to its natural state. The Coalition's counter-modification programs revealed that artificial psychological conditioning could be reversed, but only through techniques that required the active participation of the individuals being treated. Recovery required not just medical intervention, but conscious choice to embrace the psychological characteristics that the contingency had tried to eliminate. The process was difficult and often painful, forcing individuals to confront aspects of consciousness that their conditioning had made deeply uncomfortable. Professor Senna coordinated educational programs designed to help modified individuals recognize the artificial nature of their conditioning and understand the psychological techniques that had been used to shape their development. These programs needed to be carefully structured to avoid triggering defensive responses while providing the information and support necessary for individuals to begin the process of psychological recovery. The resistance movement's greatest victory came with the discovery that consciousness modification programs could be permanently disabled through coordinated force-based intervention. Jedi survivors working with naturally force-sensitive individuals who had retained resistance to modification developed techniques for severing the artificial neural pathways that maintain psychological conditioning, freeing affected individuals to develop natural moral reasoning capabilities. Agent Callus established intelligence networks dedicated to monitoring for signs of contingency continuation activities, recognizing that an organization that had operated successfully for millennia would not be completely eliminated by a single coordinated response. These networks included both technical surveillance systems and force-sensitive individuals who could detect the psychological signatures associated with consciousness modification programs. The long-term implications of the galaxy's exposure to systematic consciousness modification would require generations to fully address. Entire populations had been affected by genetic modifications that would influence their development for decades to come, while cultural and social institutions had been shaped by centuries of artificial influence that could not be quickly or easily reversed. Dr. Vasquez coordinated the establishment of research institutions dedicated to studying consciousness itself, organizations designed to develop a deeper understanding of what made sentient beings capable of moral reasoning, creative thinking, and spiritual growth. These institutions would serve as guardians of natural consciousness, working to identify and counter future attempts at systematic modification while preserving the diversity of psychological development that had made galactic civilization possible. The preserved consciousnesses that had coordinated the contingency's operations were eventually contained within isolation systems that prevented them from influencing external events while preserving them for study. The knowledge they possessed about consciousness modification techniques was too valuable to destroy, but too dangerous to leave accessible to individuals who might be tempted to use it for their own purposes. But perhaps most importantly, The galaxy's confrontation with the contingency had awakened widespread awareness of consciousness as something that required active protection and cultivation. Educational systems throughout New Republic space began incorporating training in critical thinking and moral reasoning, while cultural institutions worked to preserve and celebrate the diversity of psychological development that had been targeted by modification programs. The coalition that had formed to oppose the contingency evolved into a permanent organization dedicated to monitoring for threats to consciousness and supporting individuals and communities affected by artificial modification. This organization operated with the understanding that the capacity for independent moral reasoning was not something that could be taken for granted, but required constant vigilance and active cultivation to maintain. Professor Senna established archives dedicated to preserving records of the contingency's operations and the techniques that had been developed to counter consciousness modification, ensuring that future generations would have the knowledge necessary to recognize and resist similar threats. These archives served as both historical record and practical resource, documenting both the techniques used to attack consciousness and the methods that had proven effective in defending it. As the immediate crisis passed and the galaxy began the long process of recovery from centuries of systematic consciousness modification, the survivors of the investigation carried with them the knowledge that they had participated in the most important battle in galactic history. They had not simply defeated a political enemy or military threat, but had preserved the fundamental capacity that made sentient beings capable of choosing between good and evil. The victory was incomplete and fragile, requiring ongoing vigilance and commitment from beings who understood that consciousness itself was both the most precious and the most vulnerable aspect of sentient existence. But it was a victory nonetheless, preserving the possibility that future generations would retain the capacity for the kind of moral reasoning and creative thinking that had made their resistance possible in the first place. Years have passed since the galaxy awakened to the truth about consciousness modification and began the slow, patient work of healing from centuries of systematic manipulation. Elena Vasquez stands now in the memorial garden on Chandrila, where the names of those who gave their lives to preserve free will are carved into living crystal that grows more beautiful with each passing season. The garden serves as both remembrance and promise, a place where visitors can reflect on the preciousness of consciousness itself and the eternal vigilance required to protect it. The sunset light filtering through Chandrila's atmosphere carries a warmth that seems to penetrate deeper than mere physical sensation, touching something fundamental in the observer's awareness of their own capacity for choice and growth. This warmth represents more than comfort or beauty. It embodies the victory that was won not through weapons or political maneuvering, but through the simple recognition that consciousness is the most sacred aspect of existence and worth any sacrifice to preserve. Professor Davin Senna has returned to her academic work, but her research now focuses on documenting and celebrating the diversity of natural psychological development across different species and cultures. Her studies have revealed that consciousness, when allowed to develop without artificial interference, creates patterns of remarkable beauty and complexity that no amount of genetic modification could improve. Her work serves as a testament to the inherent worth of natural sentient development and provides guidance for educational systems throughout the galaxy. The evening breeze carries with it the sounds of children playing in nearby courtyards, their laughter unmarked by the artificial limitations that had constrained previous generations. These children represent the first generation born after the contingency's defeat, raised with full awareness of their capacity for moral reasoning and creative thinking. Their development provides hope that the galaxy's recovery from systematic consciousness modification is not only possible but inevitable. Agent Callus has found peace in a role that once would have seemed impossible for a former Imperial operative. He serves as coordinator for the Consciousness Protection Alliance, the organization that emerged from their original coalition to monitor for threats to natural psychological development. His work involves not surveillance or enforcement, but education and support for communities learning to recognize and celebrate their capacity for independent moral reasoning. The stars visible in Chandrila's darkening sky represent not just distant suns, but the countless worlds where beings are rediscovering what it means to think and feel without artificial constraints. Each point of light in the celestial display above tells a story of recovery, of populations learning to trust their natural capacity for empathy and moral judgment after generations of conditioning that had made such trust seem dangerous or impossible. Dr. Vasquez often returns to this memorial garden when she needs to remember why their struggle was necessary and why its continuation remains essential. The work of documenting and countering consciousness modification has revealed that evil's most insidious aspect is not its obvious cruelty, but its ability to convince beings that their natural capacity for growth and choice is somehow flawed or dangerous. The garden serves as a reminder that such capacity is instead the source of everything beautiful and meaningful in existence. The memorial crystals pulse gently with bioluminescent patterns that mirror the neural activity of healthy, unmodified consciousness. These patterns were discovered during research into natural psychological development, revealing that consciousness itself creates rhythms and harmonies that reflect the fundamental structures underlying all existence. The crystals serve as both artistic display and scientific demonstration of the beauty inherent in unmanipulated awareness. Medical research continues throughout the galaxy, but now focuses on understanding and supporting natural consciousness rather than modifying or controlling it. The techniques developed to counter the contingency's modifications have evolved into therapeutic approaches that help all beings develop their full potential for moral reasoning, creative thinking, and spiritual growth. These approaches recognize that consciousness is not a problem to be solved, but a gift to be celebrated and nurtured. The former research facility on Biases has been transformed into a center for consciousness studies, where beings from across the galaxy come to learn about the nature of awareness itself. The dark chambers where ancient evil once plotted the elimination of free will now host meditative gatherings where participants explore the depths of their own capacity for growth and understanding. The transformation represents more than simple renovation. It embodies the principle that even the deepest darkness can be transformed into sources of light and wisdom. Educational institutions throughout New Republic space have integrated consciousness awareness into their core curricula, teaching students not just technical knowledge, but appreciation for their own capacity to think independently and make moral choices. These programs recognize that the ability to distinguish between good and evil is not automatic, but requires cultivation and support from communities that understand its value. The gentle sounds of evening settling over Chandrila create a symphony of natural rhythms that consciousness, when unmodified, instinctively recognizes as beautiful and meaningful. These sounds represent the harmony that emerges when beings are free to develop according to their natural psychological patterns, rather than artificial constraints imposed by those who fear the unpredictability of genuine choice. Dr. Vasquez has established research archives that preserve not only the technical details of consciousness modification techniques, but also records of natural psychological development across different species and cultures. These archives serve future generations as both warning and inspiration, documenting the techniques that threaten consciousness while celebrating the diversity and beauty of natural awareness when allowed to flourish without interference. The work continues because vigilance remains necessary. Consciousness is simultaneously the most robust and most vulnerable aspect of sentient existence. It can survive unimaginable trauma and oppression, yet it can also be subtly compromised by influences so gradual that their effects become apparent only across generations. The Memorial Garden serves as a reminder that protecting consciousness requires not dramatic gestures but patient, consistent commitment to recognizing and nurturing its natural development. As night deepens over Chandrila, the memorial crystals provide gentle illumination that allows visitors to continue their contemplation without harsh artificial lighting that might disturb the peaceful atmosphere. This soft radiance represents the kind of guidance that consciousness requires, present when needed, unobtrusive when not, always respectful of the individual's capacity to choose their own path toward understanding and growth. The galaxy has learned that consciousness is not something to be perfected through external modification, but something to be honored and protected as the source of everything that makes existence worthwhile. The capacity for moral reasoning, creative thinking, and spiritual growth represents not a flaw to be corrected, but the fundamental basis of what makes beings capable of love, beauty, and hope. Professor Senna's evening meditation sessions in the garden attract beings from across the galaxy who seek to understand their own consciousness more deeply. These sessions involve not instruction or guidance, but simply shared appreciation for the miracle of awareness itself and the responsibility that comes with possessing the capacity to choose between good and evil. The peaceful conclusion of their story lies not in the defeat of specific villains or the destruction of particular institutions, but in the galaxy's rediscovery of consciousness as something precious beyond measure. The real victory was not military or political, but philosophical and spiritual, the recognition that the capacity for independent moral reasoning is the most valuable aspect of sentient existence and deserves protection at any cost. As the night sky reveals its full glory above the memorial garden, visitors often experience a profound sense of connection, not just to the beings whose sacrifice made their freedom possible, but to the fundamental structures of existence that make consciousness possible in the first place. This connection represents the ultimate goal of all their efforts, not just to preserve consciousness from external threats, but to help beings appreciate and develop the full potential of their natural capacity for awareness, choice, and growth. The gentle night breeze carries with it the promise that tomorrow will bring new opportunities for beings throughout the galaxy to exercise their capacity for moral reasoning, creative thinking, and spiritual development. This promise represents the true meaning of their victory and the foundation of hope for all future generations who will inherit the precious gift of unmodified consciousness and the eternal responsibility to protect and nurture it for those who come after them.